My stepdad said, "Family doesn't owe family anything." Then I found receipts for my inheritance he spent. I was 21 when my real father died in a construction accident. The funeral was small, just me, my mom, and a handful of Dad's coworkers who brought casseroles and stood awkwardly by the refreshment table. Mom had divorced him when I was 7, citing irreconcilable differences that I later understood meant his drinking. But Dad got sober 3 years before he died, and we'd rebuilt something fragile but real during those years. Sunday dinners at his apartment, phone calls where he asked about my community college classes, small things that meant everything because we both knew how close we'd come to losing each other entirely. Brad showed up to the funeral in a suit I'd never seen before. He'd been dating my mom for about 8 months at that point, and I didn't hate him exactly, but I didn't love him either. He was just there, filling space in our house with his too loud laugh and his habit of leaving dishes in the sink. He shook hands with Dad's coworkers and made appropriate sympathetic noises, but I caught him checking his phone during the service. Mom didn't notice because she was too busy crying into tissues that Brad kept handing her with practiced efficiency. 2 weeks after the funeral, a lawyer named Douglas Kemp called my cell while I was restocking shelves at the grocery store where I worked part-time. He said he'd been trying to reach me about my father's estate and needed to schedule a meeting. I told him I didn't know Dad had an estate, that he'd lived in a 1-bedroom apartment and drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it. Douglas said we should still meet, and something in his voice made my stomach drop. We set an appointment for the following Thursday at his office downtown. The office smelled like old paper and coffee. Douglas was maybe 60 with reading glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He spread documents across his desk and explained that my father had a life insurance policy through his union. $250,000 with me listed as the sole beneficiary. The words hit me like physical objects I couldn't catch. Dad had been paying into this policy for 19 years, even during the worst of his drinking, even when he could barely afford groceries. Douglas pushed a form across the desk and said I needed to fill out some paperwork, but the money should be deposited within 30 days. I drove home in a daze and found Mom and Brad in the kitchen. They were cooking dinner together, laughing at something on Brad's phone. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them move around each other with easy familiarity, and felt suddenly like an outsider in my own house. When I told them about the insurance policy, Mom's face lit up with genuine happiness. She hugged me and said Dad would be so proud that he'd taken care of me one last time. Brad congratulated me and suggested we go out to celebrate, which felt wrong, but I didn't know how to say no. At dinner, Brad ordered expensive wine and kept toasting to new beginnings. He talked about smart ways to invest money and suggested I meet with his financial advisor. Mom nodded along, saying Brad really knew about these things because he worked in sales. I mostly pushed pasta around my plate and wondered why I felt uneasy instead of grateful. On the drive home, Brad launched into a speech about family helping family and how we should pool our resources now that we were all doing better. I didn't respond because I was trying to figure out what he meant by we. The insurance money hit my account on a Wednesday morning exactly 29 days after my meeting with Douglas. I checked my banking app during my break and stared at the balance until my eyes watered. $250,000. More money than I'd ever imagined having. More money than made sense when I was earning $11 an hour stocking shelves and living in my childhood bedroom. I felt grateful and terrified and completely overwhelmed. That night, Mom sat me down at the kitchen table with Brad beside her. She was wringing her hands the way she did when she was nervous, and Brad kept his expression carefully neutral. Mom said they needed to talk to me about something important. She explained that she and Brad were behind on the mortgage because she'd taken unpaid leave after Dad's funeral. They were 3 months behind and the bank had sent a final notice. Brad jumped in to say they just needed help catching up, maybe $15,000 to get current and avoid foreclosure. He added that family takes care of family and I'd be helping Mom keep the house where I grew up. The number felt huge but also manageable compared to what I had. I said yes before really thinking it through because Mom looked so worried, and Brad kept emphasizing that I'd be saving my childhood home. We went to the bank the next morning and I wrote a check for $15,000. Brad insisted on coming inside with us and stood close enough that I could smell his cologne while I signed the forms. The teller counted out the cashier's check and Brad took it from the counter before I could reach for it. He said he'd handle depositing it directly to the mortgage company to make sure everything got processed correctly. 2 weeks later, Brad mentioned that his car had died and he needed to replace it for work. He sold insurance from home mostly, but said he had to visit clients sometimes and couldn't do that without reliable transportation. He showed me listings for used sedans in the $8,000 range. Mom chimed in that Brad really did need a car and it would help both of them if he could get something dependable. I wrote another check, this time for $9,000 so he'd have money for registration and insurance too. Brad hugged me and called me a lifesaver. Over the next 4 months, the requests kept coming. Mom needed dental work that insurance didn't cover. Brad's mother got sick and he needed to fly out to help her. The water heater broke and needed replacing immediately. The property taxes were due. Each request came with explanations that made sense individually, and each amount was manageable enough that saying no felt petty. I kept a running total in my head and tried not to think about how quickly the numbers were adding up. By September, I'd given them $47,000. I started picking up extra shifts at the grocery store. Not because I needed the money exactly, but because working kept me from thinking too much about my shrinking bank account. My manager noticed I was always available and promoted me to assistant supervisor with a small raise. I threw myself into the work, reorganizing inventory systems and training new hires. It felt good to build something I could control. In October, Brad approached me about investing in his friend's new business. He said Terrence was opening a franchise and needed capital from investors. If I put in $25,000 now, I'd see returns within a year that would double my investment. Brad had charts printed out showing projected earnings. Mom sat quietly during this pitch, not encouraging but not discouraging either. I said I needed to think about it, and Brad's expression shifted into something I couldn't quite read. He said I should trust him because family doesn't steer family wrong. I didn't invest in Terrence's franchise. Something about the way Brad pushed made my instincts scream. He brought it up 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, each time with increasing frustration. He started making comments about how I was sitting on all this money while they were struggling, how I was being selfish with resources that should be helping the whole family. Mom would tell him to drop it, but never defended me directly. The tension in the house became thick enough to taste. I started spending more time at my friend Simone's apartment. She was the one person who knew about the inheritance because she'd been with me the day Douglas called. Simone worked as a paralegal and had her own place across town where I could breathe without feeling guilty. One night in November, I was venting about another request from Brad when Simone stopped me mid-sentence. She asked when I'd last seen actual documentation for any of the money I'd given them, bank statements showing the mortgage payments, receipts for the dental work, anything concrete. I realized I hadn't seen any of it. I'd written checks and assumed they went where Brad said they went. Simone pulled up the county property records on her laptop and showed me that Mom's mortgage was current, but it had never been 3 months behind. The last payment made before I gave Brad that first $15,000 was only 3 weeks late. My stomach turned as Simone kept clicking through public records. The property taxes I'd supposedly paid had actually been paid 6 months earlier. The water heater replacement would have been covered by Mom's home warranty. I went home that night and waited for Brad to go to bed before asking Mom to see the bills I'd been helping pay. She looked confused and said Brad handled all of that. I pressed harder, asking to see the mortgage statements and utility bills. Mom got defensive, saying I didn't trust her and that family doesn't interrogate family. I said I just wanted to understand where my money went. She told me to ask Brad in the morning and went to bed angry. I couldn't sleep. I kept running numbers in my head and trying to make them make sense. At 3 in the morning, I went down to the home office where Brad kept his desk. The door wasn't locked and his filing system was surprisingly organized. I found folders labeled with months and started pulling bank statements. Mom's checking account showed deposits from me, but instead of going to the mortgage company or utility companies, the money was transferred immediately to an account I didn't recognize. I took photos of every statement with my phone. My hands shook so badly I had to retake several pictures. The account number kept appearing, and finally I found a statement that showed the account holder's name, Brad's business account. Every dollar I'd given them had gone into this account and then been spent on things that had nothing to do with household expenses. Lease payments for a luxury SUV I'd never seen, cash withdrawals at casinos, purchases at jewelry stores and high-end restaurants. Dawn was breaking when I finished photographing everything. I'd found $43,000 in documented transfers from my checks into Brad's account. The dates matched every request he'd made. I'd been funding his lifestyle while he told me I was saving my childhood home. The betrayal felt physical, like something sharp lodged behind my ribs. I packed a bag as quietly as I could and drove to Simone's apartment. She opened the door in her bathrobe and let me in without questions. I showed her the photos and she started making a list of what we needed to do. First was opening a new bank account that Mom and Brad couldn't access. Second was getting my belongings out of the house while they were both gone. Third was finding a lawyer who specialized in financial fraud. Simone helped me execute the plan over the next 2 days. We moved my stuff to a storage unit. I opened new accounts at a different bank and transferred what was left of the insurance money. Simone's boss referred me to Claudia Marsh, an attorney who agreed to meet with me that Friday. Claudia listened to my story without interrupting and reviewed all the photos I'd taken. She said I had a strong case for theft by deception and could pursue both criminal charges and civil recovery. Mom called me 17 times on Saturday. I didn't answer. She left voicemails alternating between worried and angry. Brad sent texts demanding to know where I was and saying I was breaking my mother's heart. Sunday morning, Claudia sent formal demand letters to both Mom and Brad outlining the evidence of financial fraud and requiring them to preserve all documents. She explained this was necessary before filing anything with the court. Brad showed up at Simone's apartment Sunday evening. I watched from the window as he knocked and called my name. Simone had already called the police and 2 officers arrived within 10 minutes. They talked to Brad in the parking lot while I gave a statement inside. The officers took the demand letter and my documentation. They told Brad to leave and warned him not to come back. The next week crawled. I went to work and tried to act normal while my phone exploded with messages from relatives I barely knew. Mom had apparently told everyone I'd abandoned her in her time of need. Brad was spinning a story about me being mentally unstable and accusing him of impossible things. My aunt left a voicemail saying I should be ashamed of myself for treating my mother this way. Family is family, she said, and you don't destroy family over money. Claudia filed the civil suit on a Thursday. Brad and Mom were served at the house on Friday morning. Mom called me crying, begging me to drop the lawsuit and come home. She said we could work it out as a family and didn't need lawyers getting involved. I told her I wasn't dropping anything and hung up. Brad sent a text that night. You're making a huge mistake. Family doesn't owe family anything, remember? That phrase unlocked something. I remembered Brad saying it at dinner months ago when I'd asked if I should write up loan agreements for the money I was giving them. He'd laughed and said, family doesn't operate like a business. Family doesn't owe family anything. He'd used that phrase to make me feel guilty for even thinking about documentation. Now he was using it to suggest I had no right to want my money back. Discovery phase started in January. Claudia subpoenaed Brad's bank records and found exactly what I'd documented plus more. $51,000 of my money had flowed through his account. He'd bought a boat I'd never seen or knew existed. He'd made payments on a timeshare in Florida. He'd paid off credit cards and funded his gambling habit. None of it had gone to household expenses or family emergencies. Mom's deposition happened in February. She sat across from Claudia in a conference room and admitted she'd known Brad was taking the money, but thought he was investing it for our future. She cried through most of her testimony and kept saying she never meant for this to happen. Claudia asked if Mom had ever verified where the money went, or if she just trusted Brad. Mom said she trusted her husband and didn't think she needed to verify anything. Brad's deposition was different. He came prepared with his own attorney and a rehearsed story. He claimed every dollar had been spent on legitimate family expenses, and that I'd given the money as gifts, not loans. His attorney tried to argue that family members giving each other money created no legal obligation for repayment. Claudia demolished this argument by showing the documented lies about what the money was for. She presented the mortgage records proving there had been no foreclosure risk. She showed receipts proving the dental work had been covered by insurance. Brad's story fell apart under questioning. The trial was scheduled for June, but Brad's attorney approached Claudia in May with a settlement offer. They proposed Brad would pay back $30,000 over 5 years if I dropped the criminal complaint I'd filed. Claudia said it was insulting and we should reject it. I agreed. We went to trial. The trial lasted 4 days. I testified about every request Brad had made and every lie he'd told. Mom testified reluctantly, contradicting Brad's story about the money being gifts. The boat dealer testified about selling Brad a $23,000 fishing boat 3 months after Dad died. The casino provided records of Brad's gambling losses totaling $18,000 during the same time period. Brad's attorney tried to argue that I'd given the money willingly, but Claudia proved each transaction had been secured through specific false representations about what the money would be used for. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict in my favor. They awarded me $51,000 in compensatory damages, plus $37,000 in punitive damages for fraud. The judge ordered Brad to pay within 90 days or face wage garnishment. He also referred the case to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution. Mom divorced Brad 3 months after the trial. She called to tell me and said she was sorry for not protecting me. Sorry for letting him manipulate both of us. Sorry for choosing him over me when it mattered. I told her I needed time before we could have a relationship again. She said she understood and would wait as long as it took. Brad declared bankruptcy trying to avoid paying the judgment, but Claudia said fraud debts couldn't be discharged. He'd be paying me for years. I used some of the settlement money to finish my associate degree and transferred to a 4-year university. I moved into my own apartment and learned what it felt like to have boundaries that people actually respected. Simone became my chosen family, the person who showed up when it mattered. Dad's insurance money had been meant to give me a better future, and despite Brad's best efforts to steal it, that's exactly what I was building. Sometimes family doesn't mean the people you're related to. Sometimes it means the people who have your back when everyone else is taking your money.